The envelope arrived on a morning so cold that Alder Kincaid's breath hung in the air like fog, and when he broke the wax seal with fingers still numb from checking his trap lines, he read the words 3 times before they made any sense at all. Congratulations. You have won the Thornpike Harvest Lottery. Your prize, a formal dinner with Brenna Fenhallow, daughter of Chief Gareth Fenhallow. The dinner will take place 7 days hence at sunset in the chief's longhouse. Attendance is expected. Alder set the letter on the rough wooden table in his cabin and stared at it as though it might suddenly sprout legs and explain itself. He had never entered any lottery. He was certain of that. His life revolved around solitude, trap lines that stretched through the frost-blanketed forest, and the occasional trip into Thornpike to trade furs. The orc village sat at the edge of the frontier, a cluster of sturdy buildings and smoke-rising chimneys where the forest met the foothills, and Alder had conducted business there for 3 years without incident. Respectful nods, fair trades, nothing more. Except that was not entirely true, and he knew it. He had seen Brenna Fenhallow 6 months ago at the autumn market. She had been haggling with a human merchant over the price of iron nails, her voice firm and her arguments sharper than the tools she was buying. Green skin that caught the afternoon light, small tusks that showed when she smiled at a joke from one of the village children. Dark hair braided back from a face that was strong-featured and handsome in a way that had made Alder stop in the middle of the square and forget what he had come to purchase. He had watched her from a distance after that. Not stalking, nothing improper. Just noticing when she passed through the market, when she worked in the communal gardens, when she led the younger orcs in archery practice at the edge of the village. He had told himself it was idle observation, the kind of thing a man did when he spent too much time alone in the woods. But his heart had known better. It had known the first time she laughed at something her friend said, and the sound carried across the square like warmth against winter. Now someone had entered his name in a lottery he had never heard of, and the prize was dinner with the one person in Thornpike he had been too cautious to approach. Alder spent the next 3 days trying to find out who had done it. He asked the human traders who frequented both the village and the surrounding homesteads. He asked the innkeeper in the nearest human settlement, a woman who knew every piece of gossip within a day's ride. No one admitted to knowing anything about it, though the innkeeper gave him a strange look and said, "You are lucky, you know. Orc hospitality is no small thing, do not waste it." He almost did not go. The thought of sitting across from Brenna Fenhallow at a formal dinner, with her father and half the village watching, made his stomach knot. He was a trapper, a man who lived on the margins of society by choice, whose conversation skills had rusted from disuse. What would he even say? But the letter had said attendance was expected, and Alder had been raised to honor obligations even when they made no sense. So on the 7th day, as the sun dipped toward the horizon and turned the sky the color of embers, he washed in the creek near his cabin until his skin burned from the cold, put on his cleanest shirt and his good wool coat, and walked the 2 miles to Thornpike. The village was larger than most human settlements in the area, a testament to orc craftsmanship and communal effort. The longhouse stood at its center, a building of timber and stone with a roof that peaked high enough to accommodate the press of bodies during gatherings. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows. Alder could hear voices inside, laughter and conversation in the guttural orc tongue mixed with the common language most frontier folk used for trade. He hesitated at the door. His hand hovered over the iron handle. Then the door swung open from the inside, and a young orc boy looked up at him with wide eyes. "You are the human," the boy said. "The winner. Come in." They are waiting. The interior of the longhouse was warm and smelled of roasted meat and root vegetables. Long tables stretched the length of the room, and orcs of all ages sat eating and talking, their voices a comfortable rumble. At the far end, on a raised platform, a single table had been set apart. 3 chairs, 3 place settings. Chief Brenna Fenhallow sat in the center chair, a broad-shouldered orc with graying hair and a face carved from stone. To his right sat Brenna. Alder felt his breath catch despite himself. She wore a tunic of deep blue, embroidered at the collar and cuffs, and her hair was unbraided for once, falling in dark waves past her shoulders. When she saw him, her eyes widened just slightly, and something that might have been nervousness flickered across her face before she schooled it into calm. The chief stood. The room quieted. "Alder Kincaid," Gareth said, his voice carrying easily. "Winner of the harvest lottery, come forward." Alder walked the length of the longhouse with every eye on him. He was aware of the whispers, the curious stares. Humans did not often dine at the chief's table. He climbed the 2 steps to the platform and inclined his head respectfully. "Chief Fenhallow, thank you for the invitation." "You earned it," Gareth said, though his tone was unreadable. "The lottery is a tradition, a way to honor those who have contributed to the village's prosperity. Your furs are of high quality and you trade fairly. The village values that. Sit." Alder took the chair to the chief's left, across from Brenna, close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose, the way her hands rested carefully on the table as though she was keeping them under tight control. Serving dishes were brought out. Venison roasted with herbs, winter squash baked with honey, thick bread still warm from the oven, a stew rich with mushrooms and barley. It was a feast by any measure, and Alder was suddenly, acutely aware that he had no idea what he was supposed to do. Make conversation, eat in silence, compliment the food. Gareth served himself and gestured for Alder to do the same. "Tell me, Kincaid, how long have you been trapping in these woods?" "5 years, sir. 3 in this region." "Good hunting." "Good enough." "The forest provides if you know where to look." "And you live alone out there?" It was not quite a question, but Alder answered anyway. "Yes, sir. That is a hard life. Lonely." Alder met the chief's gaze steadily. "It suits me." Gareth made a non-committal sound and turned his attention to his plate. The silence stretched, broken only by the clink of utensils and the murmur of conversation from the tables below. Alder ate carefully, trying not to seem too eager despite the fact that the food was better than anything he had tasted in months. Then Brenna spoke. "You ever get tired of it?" Her voice was softer than he had expected, but clear. "The solitude, I mean." He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was difficult to read, curious maybe, or something more. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But solitude has its own kind of peace. And what do you do when the peace is not enough?" It was a strange question, one that seemed to carry weight beyond its words. Alder considered his answer carefully. "I find something worth coming out of the woods for," he said, her lips curved into a small smile. "Like a lottery prize, like that." Gareth cleared his throat. "Brenna, you are making our guest uncomfortable." "I do not think he is uncomfortable," Brenna said, her eyes still on Alder. "Are you, Mr. Kincaid?" "No," Alder said. "Not uncomfortable." The meal continued, and slowly the conversation became less stilted. Gareth asked about the state of the trap lines, about whether Alder had seen signs of wolves or other predators. Alder answered honestly, and found himself asking questions in return. About the harvest, about the village preparations for winter, about the ironwork he had seen in the market. Brenna joined in, her contributions thoughtful and often laced with dry humor that surprised him. She was not what he had expected. Not that he had allowed himself to expect anything, but if he had, it would not have been this. The quick intelligence, the way she teased her father with obvious affection, the moments when she looked at Alder and seemed to be weighing something he could not guess at. When the meal was finished and the plates cleared away, Gareth stood. "It has been a good evening," he said. "Kincaid, you are welcome in Thornpike. May the winter be kind to you." It was a dismissal, polite but firm. Alder rose and inclined his head to the chief, then to Brenna. "Thank you for the meal and the company." He turned to leave, but Brenna stood as well. "I will walk him out," she said. Gareth's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or displeasure, but he nodded curtly. "Do not be long." Brenna led Alder down from the platform and through the longhouse. The other orcs watched but said nothing. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, and the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. They walked a short distance from the longhouse, far enough that the noise from inside was muted. Brenna stopped and turned to face him. "I need to tell you something," she said. Alder waited. She took a breath, and for the first time that evening she looked uncertain. "The lottery. It was not random." "I figured," Alder said quietly, her eyes widened slightly. "You did. I never entered. Someone put my name in. I have been trying to figure out who. It was me." The words hung in the cold air between them. Alder stared at her, his mind working to catch up. "You?" "Yes." Brenna's hands clenched at her sides. "I rigged it, the whole thing. I noticed you months ago at the market, and then I saw you watching me, not in a bad way, just watching. And I wanted to know why, but I could not just approach you. My father would never allow it. So I invented the lottery and made sure your name would be drawn." Alder felt something loosen in his chest, something he had not realized was tight. "You went through all that trouble for a dinner, for a chance to talk to you," she said, "to see if what I thought I saw was real." "And what did you think you saw?" She met his gaze, and there was a vulnerability there that caught him off guard. "Someone who looked at me the way I look at the horizon, like maybe there was something worth reaching for." He wanted to close the distance between them, to take her hand or say something that would match the honesty she had just given him. But the longhouse was close, and the door could open at any moment, and he could feel the weight of her father's authority like a physical presence. "Your father does not know," he said. "No, and he cannot, not yet. He is negotiating a marriage for me with a clan to the north, a strategic alliance. He thinks it is what is best for the village." Alder felt the words like a punch. "Are you going to accept it?" "I have not decided," Brenna said. "But I needed to meet you first, properly, to know if I was foolish for thinking there could be something here." "You are not foolish," she smiled, and it was a sad, uncertain thing. "Then what do we do?" He did not have an answer, not yet. But he looked at her, this orc woman who had rigged a lottery just for the chance to sit across from him, and he felt the decision settle into his bones. "I proved to your father that I am worth more than a strategic alliance," he said. "How? I do not know yet, but I will find a way." She reached out and her hand brushed against his just for a moment. It was the barest touch, but it burned like a promise. "Be careful," she said. "My father is not a man who changes his mind easily." "Neither am I." She laughed softly, and the sound was warmer than the longhouse fire. Then she turned and walked back inside, leaving Alder standing in the cold with the stars above, and a purpose kindling in his chest that felt more solid than anything he had known in years. The next morning, Alder returned to his trap lines with his mind full of Brenna Fenhallow and his heart full of a determination that bordered on reckless. He had told her he would prove himself to her father, but the question was how. Gareth Fenhallow was a chief, a man who had led his clan through hard times and held the respect of every orc in Thornpike. Alder was a human trapper with no family name, no wealth, and no connections. What could he offer that would outweigh a strategic alliance? The answer came a week later in the form of a howl that echoed through the forest at dawn. Alder had been checking his northernmost traps when he heard it, the long, mournful cry of a wolf followed by others, not just one or two. A pack. He crouched low and listened, counting the voices. At least 7, maybe more. Too many for a normal hunting pack and too close to Thornpike for comfort. He left his traps and moved carefully through the trees, following the sound. It did not take long to find them. A pack of winter wolves, their fur pale gray and their eyes gleaming with hunger. They were circling something, and when Alder climbed a ridge to get a better view, his stomach dropped. Thornpike's herd. The village kept a small herd of cattle in a pasture on the northern edge of the settlement, animals that would provide meat and milk through the winter. The wolves had found them, and the fence that enclosed the pasture would not hold for long. Alder turned and ran. He reached Thornpike in less than an hour, his lungs burning and his legs aching. The village was just waking, smoke rising from chimneys and voices calling greetings. He found the first orc he saw, a broad-shouldered man mending a fence. "Wolves," Alder gasped. "North pasture. Big pack." The orc's eyes widened and he dropped his tools and ran toward the longhouse, shouting in the orc tongue. Within minutes, the village was in motion. Gareth Fenhallow emerged from the longhouse with a bow in hand and a quiver on his back, and a dozen other orcs armed themselves quickly and efficiently. Brenna was among them. She wore leather armor and carried a spear, and when she saw Alder her expression shifted from grim focus to something that might have been relief. "You brought the warning," Gareth said, striding up to Alder. "How many wolves?" "At least 7. Maybe 10. They were circling the herd when I left." Gareth swore under his breath. "We need to move fast. Kincaid, you know the terrain. Lead the way." Alder did not hesitate. He turned and started back toward the pasture, the orcs following in a tight group. They moved quickly, and Alder set a pace that was just short of a run, guiding them along the paths he knew best. When they reached the pasture, the wolves were already at the fence. 2 of them had broken through, and the cattle were panicking, stamping and bellowing. One calf had been separated from the herd, and a wolf was closing in on it. Gareth shouted an order, and the orcs spread out, moving with the coordination of a trained unit. Arrows flew, and 2 wolves went down immediately. Alder did not have a bow, but he had his knife and his knowledge of the forest, and he moved along the edge of the pasture to cut off the wolves' escape route. A wolf lunged at him, teeth bared. Alder sidestepped and drove his knife into its side, the blade sinking deep. The wolf yelped and fell, and Alder pulled the knife free and kept moving. The fight was brutal and fast. The orcs were skilled, their movements efficient and deadly, and within minutes the pack was scattered. 3 wolves lay dead, and the rest had fled into the forest. The cattle were still panicking, but the calf was unharmed and the fence could be repaired. Gareth approached Alder, his face flushed from exertion. "You saved the herd. If you had not brought the warning, we would have lost half of them." Alder wiped his knife on the snow and sheathed it. "I was in the area. It was the right thing to do." "It was more than that," Gareth said. He glanced at the other orcs who were tending to the fence and calming the cattle, then back at Alder. "You did not have to come here. You could have stayed safe in your cabin, but you ran 2 hours to warn us." "That is loyalty." Alder met the chief's gaze. "Thornpike has been fair to me. I do not forget that." Gareth studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Come back to the village. We will feed you and tend to that cut on your arm." Alder looked down and realized there was a gash on his forearm, blood soaking through his sleeve. He had not even felt it. "It is nothing. It is something. Come." Back in Thornpike, Alder found himself seated in the longhouse again. this time surrounded by orcs who clapped him on the shoulder and thanked him in voices rough with gratitude. Brenna appeared with a basin of water and clean cloth, and she knelt beside him to clean the wound. "You are reckless," she said quietly, her hands gentle as she worked. "I was careful. You fought wolves with a knife. I had help." She looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. "Thank you for the warning, for helping." "I meant what I said," Alder replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I will prove myself." Her lips curved into a small smile. "I think you just did." But Gareth's voice interrupted them, calling for attention. The chief stood at the center of the longhouse, his expression serious. "Winter is here," Gareth said, "and it will be a hard one. The wolves are hungry and they will come back. We need to be ready. Kincaid, you know the forest better than any of us. Will you help us track the pack and make sure they do not return?" It was a request, but it was also a test. Alder could feel the weight of it, the way every orc in the room was watching him, waiting to see what he would say. "I will help," Alder said. Gareth nodded. "Good. You will work with Brenna. She knows the land around the village and you know the deeper forest. Between the two of you, we will keep the herd safe." Alder glanced at Brenna, and he saw the faintest flicker of surprise in her eyes before she nodded. "Understood." Over the next weeks, Alder and Brenna spent long hours in the forest together. They tracked the wolf pack, mapping its movements and setting deterrents to keep it away from the village. They worked well together, their skills complementing each other in ways that surprised them both. Brenna was a skilled tracker and a deadly shot with her bow, and she moved through the forest with a confidence that came from years of knowing the land. Alder brought knowledge of animal behavior and the patience of a hunter who had spent years alone. But beyond the practical work, they talked. Long conversations during cold watches, words that came easier when they were focused on a shared task. Brenna told him about growing up in Thornpike, about the pressure of being the chief's daughter, about the weight of expectation and the fear that she would never be able to choose her own path. Alder told her about his childhood in a human settlement to the south, about the restlessness that had driven him into the wilderness, about the peace he had found in solitude and the loneliness that had crept in over time. And slowly, carefully, they fell into something that was more than friendship. It happened in small moments. Brenna's hand steadying him when he slipped on ice, the way she laughed at his dry observations, the warmth of sitting close to a fire while the snow fell around them. Alder found himself watching her the way he had at the market, but now she watched him back, and there was no pretense between them. One evening, as they sat in a makeshift shelter waiting for the wolves to move, Brenna asked the question that had been hanging between them for days. "What happens when winter ends?" Alder looked at her. The firelight caught the green of her skin, the curve of her tusks, the dark fall of her hair. He thought about the chief's words, about the strategic alliance, about all the reasons this could never work. "I do not know," he said honestly. "But I am not ready to walk away." "Neither am I," Brenna said, "but my father is expecting an answer about the marriage. The envoy from the northern clan is coming in 2 months. Then we have 2 months to figure it out." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture so simple and so profound that it made his chest ache. "I am glad you won the lottery." He smiled despite himself. "I am glad you rigged it." The weeks wore on, and winter deepened its grip. The wolf pack moved north, driven away by the deterrents Alder and Brenna had set and the constant pressure of their tracking. The village herd remained safe, and the orcs of Thornpike began to relax, confident that the worst of the danger had passed. But then the blizzard hit. It came without warning, a wall of white that swept down from the mountains and turned the world into a howling void. Alder had been checking the northern trap lines when it struck, and he barely made it to a shallow cave before visibility dropped to nothing. He huddled in the cave entrance, his coat pulled tight and his breath visible in the frigid air, and waited for the storm to pass. It lasted 3 days. By the time the wind died and the snow stopped falling, the world was buried. Drifts as tall as a man blocked paths and bent tree branches to the breaking point. Alder dug himself out of the cave and started the long trek back to his cabin, but the landscape had changed so much that familiar landmarks were gone. He was still 2 miles from home when he heard the sound that made his blood run cold, lowing. Frightened, desperate lowing. He changed direction and found them a 1/4 mile away. A dozen cattle from Thornpike's herd, trapped in a ravine where the snow had piled so deep they could not climb out. They were freezing, their breath coming in clouds, their eyes rolling with fear. Alder looked at the sky. The sun was already sinking and the temperature was dropping fast. If the cattle stayed in the ravine overnight, they would die, and the village needed them. Needed the meat and milk they would provide, the security they represented against hunger. He was exhausted, half frozen himself, and alone. But he did not hesitate. He spent the next hours digging a path through the snow, using his hands and a flat piece of wood he found nearby. His fingers went numb, then painful, then numb again. His shoulders screamed with effort and his lungs burned from the cold air. But he kept digging, one shovelful at a time, until there was a ramp the cattle could use. Then he coaxed them out. It took patience and a calm voice, the skills of a man who understood animals. One by one, the cattle climbed the ramp and stood shivering on solid ground. When the last one was free, Alder began herding them back toward Thornpike. It was full dark by the time he reached the village, and his legs were shaking so badly he could barely walk. The cattle lowed and pressed toward the warmth of the barn, and orcs came running, their voices raised in surprise and confusion. Gareth appeared, his face grim. "Kincaid, what happened?" Alder told him, his words clipped and slow, his mind foggy from exhaustion. Gareth listened, and when Alder finished, the chief put a hand on his shoulder. "You should have left them. You could have died out there." "The village needs them," Alder said. "It was worth the risk." Gareth's expression shifted into something Alder could not quite read. "Come inside. You are half frozen." Brenna was waiting in the longhouse, and when she saw Alder, her face went pale. "You are hurt. Just cold. You are bleeding." Alder looked down and realized his hands were torn and bloody from digging, and there was a gash on his leg where he had slipped on ice and hit a rock. He had not felt any of it. Brenna guided him to a chair near the fire and began tending to his wounds, her movements brisk and efficient but her hands gentle. The other orcs gave them space, but Alder could feel them watching, could sense the shift in the way they looked at him. "You are an idiot," Brenna said, her voice tight. "Probably. You could have frozen to death." "I did not." She looked up at him and there were tears in her eyes. "Do not do that again." "I cannot promise that." "Then promise me you will be careful." He reached up and touched her cheek, heedless of who might see. "I promise to try." She let out a shaky breath and leaned into his hand just for a moment. Then she finished bandaging his wounds and stepped back, her expression composed again. Gareth approached and the room fell silent. The chief looked down at Alder, his face unreadable. "You saved the herd twice now," Gareth said. "Once from wolves, once from the storm. You have risked your life for this village without hesitation. That is more than loyalty. That is honor." Alder did not know what to say, so he said nothing. "The envoy from the northern clan is arriving tomorrow," Gareth continued. "They are coming to finalize the marriage agreement with Brenna. It is a good alliance. It will bring security and trade to Thornpike." Alder felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression steady. "But alliances are built on trust," Gareth said. And trust is earned through action, not promises. You have earned my trust, Kincaid. More than that, you have earned my respect. He turned to Brenna. I will not force you into a marriage you do not want. If the alliance matters less to you than your own heart, then I will not stand in your way. Brenna's eyes went wide. Father, but I will not dissolve the agreement lightly, Gareth said, his voice firm. The envoy deserves honesty. We will tell them the truth, and we will offer fair compensation for the broken agreement. If they accept, the matter is settled. If they do not, we will deal with the consequences. He looked back at Alder. You will stay for the meeting tomorrow. I want them to see the man my daughter has chosen. Alder nodded, his throat tight. Thank you. Gareth's expression softened just a fraction. Thank you, Kincaid, for everything. The envoy arrived the next afternoon, a delegation of 4 orcs from the northern clan led by a tall, stern-faced woman named Kara. They were welcomed into the longhouse with the full hospitality Thornpike could offer, and Gareth wasted no time in explaining the situation. Kara listened in silence, her expression giving nothing away. When Gareth finished, she turned to Brenna. Is this what you want? Kara asked. Yes, Brenna said without hesitation. Kara looked at Alder. And you, human, do you understand what you are asking? Taking an orc woman as your partner is not easy. You will face prejudice from your own kind and suspicion from ours. Are you prepared for that? Alder met her gaze steadily. I am. Why? What do you gain from this? Alder said simply. That is enough. Kara was silent for a long moment, then she turned back to Gareth. The alliance would have been useful, but I will not force a marriage where there is no willingness. My clan values honor, and there is no honor in binding someone against their heart. We will accept your compensation and consider the matter closed. Relief flooded through the room like a wave. Gareth inclined his head deeply. You have my gratitude and my friendship. And you have mine, Kara said. She glanced at Brenna, and the corner of her mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. I hope he is worth it. He is, Brenna said. The envoy stayed for the evening meal, and the conversation was cordial if not warm. When they left the next morning, Alder felt as though he could breathe fully for the first time in weeks. Gareth found him later that day as he was preparing to return to his cabin. Kincaid, a word. Alder turned. The chief looked older in the daylight, the lines on his face deeper, but there was a lightness in his expression that had not been there before. You will be part of this village now, Gareth said. If you are with Brenna, you are one of us. That means you have responsibilities. To her, to the clan, to the community. Are you ready for that? Alder thought about his cabin in the woods, the solitude he had cherished for so long. Then he thought about Brenna's laugh, the warmth of sitting beside her, the way his life had felt more complete in the past weeks than it had in years. I am ready, he said. Gareth nodded. Good. Then welcome to Thornpike. Spring came slowly to the frontier, the snow melting in patches and the rivers running high with meltwater. Alder moved his belongings to Thornpike, taking a small house near the edge of the village that had been empty for years. He continued to trap, but now he also helped with other tasks, repairing fences, teaching the younger orcs how to track game, working alongside Brenna in the communal gardens. Life in the village was different from the solitude he had known, but it was not worse. It was fuller, richer, filled with voices and laughter and the small rhythms of community life. And at the center of it all was Brenna. They were married in late spring, a ceremony that blended orc traditions with the simpler human customs Alder remembered from his childhood. The village turned out in full, and even a few humans from the surrounding homesteads attended, drawn by curiosity and by the reputation Alder had earned over the winter. The ceremony took place at sunset, the sky painted in shades of gold and rose. Brenna wore a dress of green that matched her skin, embroidered with patterns that told the story of her clan. Alder wore his best clothes, simple but clean, and when he took her hand, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a mantle. Gareth officiated, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Marriage is a bond built on trust and respect. It is a promise to stand together through hard times and to celebrate the good. Alder Kincaid, do you vow to honor Brenna Fenhallow, to support her and stand beside her for all the days of your life? I do, Alder said. Brenna Fenhallow, do you vow to honor Alder Kincaid, to support him and stand beside him for all the days of your life? I do, Brenna said, her voice steady. Then, by the authority of this clan and the witness of this community, I declare you married. May your life together be long and full of joy. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Alder pulled Brenna close and kissed her, heedless of the audience. She laughed against his mouth, and the sound was sweeter than anything he had ever known. The feast that followed was raucous and warm, filled with food and music and stories that stretched late into the night. At one point, Gareth stood and raised his cup, calling for silence. I want to make a confession, he said, his voice carrying. When Brenna first told me about the lottery, I was suspicious. I thought it was a foolish risk, but I underestimated my daughter's judgment, and I underestimated Alder Kincaid. He looked at Alder, and there was genuine warmth in his eyes. You proved your worth not with words, but with action. You saved our herd twice. You risked your life for this village. You earned a place here, and you earned my daughter's heart. I could not have asked for a better son. Alder felt his throat tighten, and Brenna squeezed his hand. To Alder and Brenna, Gareth said, raising his cup higher. May their love be as strong as the winter they survived. The crowd echoed the toast, and Alder raised his own cup, meeting Brenna's eyes across the table. She smiled, and he saw in that smile the future they would build together. A life in Thornpike, a place among the clan, a home that was more than just four walls. Later, when the feast had wound down and the guests had begun to drift away, Alder and Brenna walked together to the edge of the village. The stars were out, bright and clear, and the air was cool but no longer cold. I have something to tell you, Brenna said. Alder looked at her. What is it? The lottery. I need to confess the full truth. She took a breath. I did not just rig it, I invented it from whole cloth. There was no harvest lottery tradition. I made the entire thing up, printed the announcement, and made sure you got the letter. My father believed it was real because I convinced the village council to go along with it. Alder stared at her for a moment. Then he started to laugh. You invented a lottery. Yes, and convinced the entire village to play along. Yes, he shook his head, still laughing. That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. Are you angry? No. He pulled her close, his arms around her waist. I am impressed and grateful. If you had not done it, I never would have had the courage to approach you. I know, she said, smiling up at him. That is why I did it. He kissed her, slow and deep, and when they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. Thank you, he said, for choosing me. For taking the risk, for everything. Thank you for running 2 hours to warn us about wolves, she said, for digging cattle out of snow, for being the kind of man who does not walk away when things are hard. I will never walk away from you, I know. They stood there in the starlight, holding each other, and Alder felt a contentment settle into his bones that he had never known before. The future stretched out ahead of them, uncertain and full of challenges, but they would face it together. And that was enough. The years that followed were good ones. Alder and Brenna built a life in Thornpike that was equal parts work and joy. Alder's trapping business expanded, and he began teaching the younger orcs his skills, passing on knowledge that would serve the village well. Brenna took on more responsibilities as her father aged, stepping into a leadership role with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. They faced challenges, of course. There were humans who disapproved of their marriage, who muttered about orcs and humans mixing and the unnatural ways of the frontier. There were hard winters and poor hunts, seasons when food was scarce and tempers ran short. But through it all, they stood together, and the bond between them only grew stronger. In their second year of marriage, Brenna told Alder she was pregnant. The news filled him with a joy so profound he could barely speak, and when their daughter was born in the spring, tiny and perfect with green skin and her mother's eyes, Alder wept openly. They named her Olivia, and she was the light of their lives. She grew quickly, curious and bold with her mother's intelligence and her father's quiet determination. 2 years later, a second daughter arrived, Kara, who was gentler but no less strong. And 3 years after that, a son they named Colin, who had Alder's dark hair and Brenna's laugh. The cabin near the edge of the village grew crowded and loud, filled with the chaos of children and the warmth of family. Alder, who had once lived in solitude and thought himself content, could not imagine going back to that life. Every morning he woke to the sound of small feet running across the floor. Every evening he sat at a table surrounded by voices, and every night he fell asleep beside Brenna, grateful beyond words for the strange lottery that had changed everything. Gareth lived long enough to see his grandchildren grow, and he doted on them with a fierceness that surprised everyone. He taught Olivia to shoot a bow, told Kara stories of the old days, and took Colin on long walks through the forest, passing on the knowledge of the land that had been passed to him. When he finally passed, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, the village mourned deeply, and Alder mourned with them. Gareth had been more than a chief. He had been a father in the truest sense of the word. Brenna took over as chief, and she led Thornpike with the same wisdom and strength her father had shown. Alder stood beside her, not as a chief himself but as a partner and advisor, and together they guided the village through good times and hard. The children grew. Olivia became a skilled hunter, Kara a talented weaver, and Colin a blacksmith whose work was sought after by traders from across the frontier. They married and had children of their own, and the cabin that had once seemed too small became the center of a sprawling family that included orcs and humans both. On a summer evening many years after the rigged lottery, Alder and Brenna sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over Thornpike. They were older now, their hair streaked with gray, their hands worn from years of work. But they were still together, still strong, still in love. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not rigged that lottery?" Brenna asked. Alder considered the question. "Sometimes, but not often. What do you think would have happened?" "I think I would have spent years watching you from a distance, too afraid to approach. And you would have married someone from the northern clan, and we both would have lived perfectly acceptable lives. But not happy ones." "No," Alder agreed. "Not like this." Brenna leaned her head on his shoulder and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade. From inside the house, they could hear the sound of their grandchildren playing, the shouts and laughter that had become the soundtrack of their lives. "I am glad you won the lottery," Brenna said. Echoing the words she had spoken so many years ago, Alder smiled. "I am glad you rigged it." And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Alder thought about the path that had led him here. The solitary cabin, the forest trap lines, the letter that had arrived on a cold morning and changed everything. He thought about the dinner with the chief's daughter, the rigged lottery, the winter that had tested him and the love that had sustained him. He thought about all the choices that had brought him to this moment, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would make every single one again. Because in the end, the greatest prize was not the dinner or the village or even the acceptance of a chief. The greatest prize was the woman beside him, the family they had built, and the life they had chosen together. And that was worth more than any lottery in the world.